profound desire to say, find somebody else that's better equipped to deal with this, because this is not crime. And so I think what we are going through right now, particularly, post-pandemic, is an evolution of our understanding for what those systems should be to respond to these conditions, but it certainly isn't law enforcement as the lead. We are seeing evolution within law enforcement to think about deploying officers who are not there to arrest, who are not there to penalize, who are there and are equipped with social service training and other types of skills to respond to those conditions. But usually they are a very small segment of the overall police department. Maybe 1 or 2%. So in downtown, we still get a lot of pressure, I would say, from stakeholders who, again, they're recollecting 1950s and 60s sort of ideas of, I recently had a stakeholder ask me if loitering was illegal or not. Right. And so there's these hangover ideas from the past. There are these relics of laws that used to be. And I don't know that information is really been understood by the community as a whole. And so they still look at law enforcement as the tip of the spear to respond to these issues. But again, we're responding way too late and with the wrong tool. And certainly the criminal justice system is not an effective system for being able to solve these problems.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. And certainly in Houston, we're really fortunate to have this focus on the right intervention for the right problem, right? And whether that's social services, whether that's a combination with our homeless outreach teams and HPD and Harris County Sheriff's Office. You mentioned kind of from the individual, the house person, the business or whatever, right? When we see something we don't know how to understand, the first thing to do is to call 911 to address this issue. Chriselle, I'm kind of curious from your perspective, the flip side. So if the tip of the spear has typically been to call 911, what is that experience like on the other end? If you're the person experiencing homelessness and you are having someone calls 911, you're having an interaction with law enforcement. Maybe this isn't the first one you have. Maybe this is something that happens regularly. What is that like for that person in sort of your experience? And can there be any effects from that type of interaction?
Sure. So I think a lot of times what happens in the general perception is that, well, if these police officers or law enforcement comes along and moves these people along, then they'll be able to find housing or they'll be forced to figure something out, right? So the bottom line is we should be able to share and let folks know what housing options there potentially are, but law enforcement should not be the stick that we use to get them there. And I think a lot of times that's the way that it comes across, even if that is not the intent, that is the way that it really comes across. And so what ends up happening is that there's this ongoing deepened distrust that was already there, but it just deepens it. And ultimately, because of the issuance of citations and compounding financial obligations, it just makes the situation even worse from the financial perspective. And then when we go even further and we take a look at who is being most impacted, I believe you all have is this a slide here?
Yes.
We'll take a look at the, if you see here, when you look at the demographics of the makeup of Harris County, right? You all can see the makeup here. And specifically, if we look at African Americans, it's 20%, 20, I think 0.6%.
Yep,
okay.
That's about right. Yeah.
African Americans. And we look at the COC system, the COC is serving 75% of African Americans. And when you look at the disproportionality there, it's astounding. And so then we have to take a look at the systemic inequities that continue to be there, that this is just showing how it continues to perpetuate. And so, Chris, you mentioned about, the yesteryears in the 50s and the 60s, things like that, Jim Crow, right? And so it's just a continuance of that. And so this is what happens. This is what criminalization looks like. And this is how it plays out. So I'm sure that we're going to talk more about this later, but I just wanted to kind of raise that and be very clear about who this is ultimately impacting here in Houston and Harris County.
Absolutely. And Ruth, I sort of to lead off of that, we really talk about criminalization and systemic barriers and how there is historical but ongoing challenges there. But really, when we think about systemic barriers and persons who may have unpaid or maybe they have an arrest, or maybe those result in jail time, how those can ultimately wind up being a barrier to housing. And so Houston, really, the success of our system over the last 10 years, and I think we had this slide up, has really been focusing on housing as the core solution to homelessness. And I really wanted to ask this question of you because the Kinder Institute just published the 2023 State of Housing Report. So can you just share some information from that report about the state of housing in Houston, affordability currently, and what we really should expect in the years to come?
Yeah. So first of all, that report, the 2023 State of Housing Report, is available on our website. So if anybody wants to refer to that report, just go to kinder.rice.edu. It's like the first thing you'll see on our web page at this moment. And the main thing that we found in this 2023 report is that housing affordability is becoming more and more of a challenge in Houston, but like a lot more of a challenge. And so even though we definitely want to recognize and applaud all the efforts that many of your organizations, including, of course, Coalition for the Homeless, great progress has been made in reducing homelessness. However, we do see some potential red flags, and that we really must pay attention to and do something about if we want to see homelessness continue to be reduced, or potentially otherwise. I think it has got we're at risk of increasing again. So housing affordability has become much more of a challenge. First of all, there are now more renters than homeowners in the city of Houston, and that will soon be the case for Harris County as well. And then among renters, we know that a majority of renters are cost burdened, which means that they have to spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. And we know that that's if anybody's spending that much or more, that means they really don't have enough left over to cover all the other basics like food, healthcare, childcare, transportation. These are basic needs that we all have. And if you're spending more than 30% of your household income on housing, you're very likely struggling to make ends meet. And if and when something goes wrong, anything, whether it's job loss, injury, illness, whatever, you are very vulnerable, especially as a renter. You are very likely to be at a place where you might actually lose your housing, which is why we should be very concerned about that trend. And actually, so it's about 52% of renters that are cost burdened. But we found that if we do some adjustments actually adjust for household size, which we know that matters a lot, and adjust for income and adjust for the actual price of goods and services, then we believe that 51% is actually an underestimate, that the real percentage of cost burdened renters is really probably over 60%, 60. That is huge. So a large majority of our renter population is struggling and in a very vulnerable position. So that's something that we definitely want to highlight, make sure that everyone is aware of that trend, that growing trend, and that we believe that there are definitely ways that we can intervene, which I know we'll talk about in a little while.
Absolutely. So not exactly an optimistic outlook, both currently and into the future. But I think important for us to really know what's coming. Chriselle, I don't know. Do you have any reaction to, I guess, what could really be, say, a concerning and gloomy outlook?
Yeah, so I would say that it's definitely concerning, but not surprising. And I think it's indicative of the affordable housing crisis that we're seeing. But the thing I guess I want to go back to is the reality that although it's a lot of talk right now about a housing affordability crisis, that this is nothing new. Like, an affordability crisis has been going on for decades, but it's about who it's affecting now. And so we can go back as far as World War II, after the GI Bill came out, and who was benefiting from that. And even when I think about, Black soldiers who were not able to fully take advantage of the GI Bill, and in many cases were exploited. Then we have the rise and the fall of public housing. That public housing was built for, low-income folks. It was segregated. It was there, but there was not much upkeep. And now we've seen just a disintegration of it, even here in Houston. Public housing is not what it used to be. And even here lately, the latest is the Clayton Homes development that we no longer have. Just caught in between, the I-45 expansion and Hurricane Harvey. And then we look at disaster recovery, and that being an issue as well. People losing their rental units, not being able to find housing again. And then we have the income inequality and just the way in which people are not earning along the lines of what the cost of living is. And typically that's been a phenomenon that has affected more so low-wage earners. But now we're seeing it more and more across the board. And COVID didn't help it in either. So now we're seeing that play out as well. So all those things, right? That affordable housing, it's not a new phenomenon. And so, but we still have to think about how do we trudge forward? How do we move forward to make those adjustments? But I just wanted us to recognize that this is nothing new.
I mean, Krishal's absolutely right about the fact that, the racial and ethnic differences there, and that they're huge. In terms of home ownership rates, for example, we saw in our recent report that among whites, the home ownership rates are around 56%. For Blacks, it's about 26%. So it's a huge difference. And we've also seen, differences in loan deniability rates, even when we try to control for similar economic status, because some people might just assume, oh, that's just because they're the economic status differences. That explains part of it, but certainly not all of it. And so all of these issues that Krishal is raising that are not just about the past, but definitely about the present, they still play a major role. So housing affordability is a huge problem for everyone, but it's even more of a problem for Blacks and Hispanics.
And one more thing I would like to note is something else that we're seeing more often now are the corporate interests that are basically commodifying housing, which is something we didn't see as much of, but we're seeing it just rampant right now. And I find it so very paradoxical that these corporate interests are coming in and, making all this money off of housing and decreasing the affordable housing stock. And I'm not sure if you all are aware of a sociologist and author, Matthew Desmond, but he wrote a book, Evicted, and most recently he released the book, Poverty of America. And I want to read a quick quote from that, because the thing that is so interesting to me is that it takes these tax subsidies and these different allowances, I'll say, that corporate interests can take advantage of, yet the poor are looked at poorly when it comes to receiving those subsidies. So the one thing that Matthew Desmond says is, most government aid goes to families that need it the least. If you add up the amount that the government is dedicating to tax breaks, mortgage interest deduction, wealth transfer tax breaks we get from our retirement accounts, our health insurance, our college savings accounts, you learn that we are doing so much more to subsidize affluence than to alleviate poverty. So if we're going to really solve this, we're going to have to leap in, and it's going to take more than a tweak here and a tweak there.
Can I jump in there?
Absolutely.
Because I agree with everything you've said. And I would just add, putting this into a scale to understand homelessness in Houston right? We have about 3,000, good number, right? Compared to the city where I came from in Los Angeles, which the number is now up to about 70,000.
Yep.
We've got about 3,000 in Houston and Harris County, population of about 3 million, right? So we're talking about 1 in 1,000 residents, right, are experiencing homelessness. If there was ever a more solvable problem, right? I mean, if to me, it's right there for us to solve. And Houston loves making headlines. Houston loves putting people on the moon, right? If we were serious about this, we would literally, this is our next moonshot, right? Every other city is struggling and going in the wrong direction. And it's really it's a resource allocation problem is all it is. And really what you just need is you need elected officials, you need leadership to recognize that this is something that we can do at the scale for Houston, which is the 4th largest city in America, to be able to be within reach of solving this problem. And this community has housed more than 3,000 people just in the last 5 years, right? And I know that more people are falling into homelessness every day, which is a whole different problem. But nevertheless, like this is really just a commitment issue that we need from our elected leadership to recognize is that this is something that we can do as a community. And I think that's where we all play a role in this, right? Is recognizing that this isn't simply about, stigmatizing individuals or thinking about the criminal justice system, but it's also figuring out like really how we step up and make commitments together and to contribute to solutions.
I think, absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say amen, but I didn't know. I was like, that was appropriate.
You're too far for me to like shake all of your hands after that. I think we really hit on, and I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation, some really key issues. But we're talking about how burdened renters are in a community being able to keep up with their housing costs. Chriselle is talking about more private equity investment that's driving up costs. We talk about natural disasters and how our housing is not even of a high quality. I think the housing study has said about 20% is below average. And so people who are housed are living in sometimes unsafe conditions, maybe still dealing with water and plumbing and sewage issues from the freeze 2 years ago. But Chris, I really kind of wanted to look to the future of what we really need to be looking for on the horizon here. You mentioned, Los Angeles. Houston is one of the fastest growing cities in America right now. And we already have, as Ruth has talked about, a really difficult housing market. And so if we look at Houston as, right, we put someone on the moon and Houston isn't going to stop growing anytime soon. If we look at the future of our city, what do we need to do in order to make this a place where businesses, families, individuals can come and live here, or they can live here for the long term and continue to build this wonderful community?
Do I get unlimited resources to
bananas? Yeah, big.
I mean, honestly, I think it starts by, housing policy that, to your point, I mean, we've got to recognize that we cannot rely on the private sector alone to develop housing, and it's affordable housing tax credits and other mechanisms to be able to develop affordable housing, permanent supportive housing are too few, and there's too competitive environment for them. In some ways, if we recognize that this is a problem, then those markets, those tax credits, those things should be broadened and be made more widely available to facilitate communities and neighborhoods and others to have access to those tools to be able to develop the right housing that fits within their neighborhood context, right? And Houston is different than a lot of cities where we don't have as vocal and as fierce a NIMBY type of issue. We also don't have the same kind of land use controls that every other city in America has. So again, if any place can solve this problem, I think it is Houston, but for really the lack of those kinds of resources that facilitate the development of that kind of housing. And that's where I think we need to broaden our understanding of who is to develop housing. After you get that done, it comes to this broader question about how do we prevent people from falling into homelessness? And I think that is the scarier proposition, right? Is every year, if we're having thousands of individuals fall through the cracks, whether it's through eviction or whatever other means are, how do we create the support systems that we are not waiting until somebody is on their deathbed to begin applying CPR, right? That's how we approach homelessness right now, right? Instead of the folks in this room that recognize that exercise and eating well helps to prevent these challenges. And, we're sort of committed to remaining healthy. Right now we respond to this issue almost at the last possible moment. And I think that we really need to fortify those systems that equip humans to perform better in society, and that's that next stage for preventing, I think, those systemic failures. But again, you've given me unlimited resources, so I'm happy to spend them.
Well, and if I could, can you hear me? Am I hitting the button? And I wish my checking account was unlimited so I could give you those resources, but not quite. I think, so Ruth, I had a question for you. We really talked about we need to treat these conditions. We need to treat these issues before, right, we're in the ER. And so what do you think are some of the reasons for the decline in housing affordability? And I think understanding the root causes, right, that can help us start to find some solutions.
Yeah, so the trend that we're seeing is essentially that the cost of rent is increasing at a faster pace than the increases in income. So that's what's generating this big, growing disparity or growing which is the word, unaffordability or inaffordability? But that's making things less and less affordable. Let me just rephrase that.
Great recovery.
Yeah. but we think that there are a lot of factors there, systemic issues going on simultaneously. There's one that I think Chriselle mentioned earlier about companies, investors. That is something that stood out for us in this year's report because we are finding a growing trend of single family resident investors. It's not a huge percentage that are owned by these companies, but it's a growing percentage. And they're, at least in Harris County, they're basically like just 15 companies. So just a small number of companies that own like thousands of units in our region. And the reason why I think we need to pay attention to that is because I think as you were alluding to earlier, that it's us, and through our own analyses using local data, we found a significant association. I'll be careful not call it causation yet. We're doing further analyses to find out, but there's a significant association between their presence and the eviction filing rates. That the growing presence of these companies, the more housing units that they own, the more that these eviction filing rates have been going up. So we know that there's definitely a correlation there. I'll stay tuned we're doing analyses right now to see if there's a causation because we need to find out whether they're the ones actually filing the evictions, and it's tricky. But we're looking into it. And there's also, in addition to our own analyses locally, there's another study that was done, I believe, in Atlanta recently that found a significant association between the presence of these companies and more housing units that they own and a reduction in home ownership rates, owner occupied home ownership rates. So both of these studies, I think we should look into it further, and there's another opportunity to potentially intervene. Now, I'm not saying that companies shouldn't be allowed to own homes, but perhaps there should be some boundaries set in place to make sure that we don't let this get out of control.
Well, and certainly, and I'll hand it over to Chris, but when we see in 2022 that there are 88,000 evictions filed in Harris County, which I believe was a 33% increase from pre-pandemic levels. I'm not going to get into the causation and correlation, but certainly there's a problem. And certainly that can, if people are losing their homes and don't have the financial ability to find a new one, the place is going to be the shelter of the street.
Yeah. And our region, by the way, the Houston Metro had the third highest increase in eviction filing rates in the country. So part of it was the bounce back from recovering from or not recovering, that's not the right word, after the moratorium that was set during the pandemic, but there's more to it than that. So we should definitely be concerned about these increases.
And just one last thing, and then I will hand it back over to Chris. I think there's two sides of that are concerning. There was a study by the U.S. Government Accountability Office or Office of Accountability that showed that homelessness can be really tied to increasing housing costs, and that if average rent went up by $100, homelessness typically increased by about 9%. And so in this sort of situation where we see ourselves right here in Houston now, where housing is becoming more and more affordable and more evictions are being filed, I think there's really great cause for concern that more people can be homeless. It also explains why the Work of the Way Home and housing 15,000 people over the last 3 years is so important, and why we haven't seen the same rises in homelessness like other cities have. So Chris, you've been waiting so patient.
I just wanted to chime in with, I wanted to add a caveat to my last sort of, if everything is perfect scenario, with what I think is a real world solution. And I think about your predecessor's book, right? And I think about, the wonderful history in Houston of being able to accommodate refugee populations and others when we have these massive influx of people, and how Houston has historically responded, and we've found a place for people. And I start to wonder, when we have these moments of defined crisis, whether it's Katrina or these other moments where we've had these influx and floods of people, why we can't adapt in a similar capacity now, right? And understand that we're living in a crisis within our own community, within our own neighbors, our own family members. And I start to think about the simple things about where I am contributing to the problem, right? And let me give you a very simple example. My wife and I live in a house in the Heights, and this house has a garage. And on top of the garage is a garage apartment that has 0 people that live inside of it. Right. It's just a housing unit that was built by the developer at the time. It came with our house. We thought, oh, maybe, when our parents come to stay, maybe they'll stay there. They never do. But my point is, how many other folks are out there that have these opportunities to unlock a housing unit that could be brought to market to be a part of the solution? And at the government level, how do we create tools to encourage other Houstonians to be a part of the solution, right? Because the most expensive way, if we had a transportation challenge in Houston and we decided that the best way to do that was the way that we understand housing right now, which is we have to build new, it means that we would solve transportation problems by buying everybody a new car, because that's the only way to get new housing, right? Is to build brand new, which is the most expensive way to do it. If you're able to unlock stuff that's already there, is that an opportunity to be able to deliver this at scale, also without having the stigmatization of things like public housing or other kinds of situations where you are concentrating poverty in a particular neighborhood, but really thinking about unlocking the opportunities that already exist within our community? And I think that there's something to be said for really starting to challenge ourselves to think differently about how to solve the problem.
I'll leave a minute if anybody wants to respond to that.
I wanted to respond to Ruth.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I had a thing on top of that I wanted to add, but what you're saying is absolutely true, and so I'm going to challenge you to open up that unit to someone. Sure.
Yeah.
But Ruth, the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm not sure what the data can capture, but one thing that we're learning out in the field is some of those corporate property owners are selling the dream of home ownership with no intent of that tenant ever becoming a homeowner. Mm-hmm. So it's happening on the front. I know several communities where this dream is being sold that, well, you're paying rent to own, mm-hmm. and that's not happening. And then on the flip side, from a reactive perspective, especially after COVID, so many homes up for foreclosure. Many communities got these little notes on their door and the envelopes and the calls, sell your house, sell your house. And again, these dreams are being sold like, well, I'll purchase your house and then you can buy it back when you get in your feet. Mm-hmm. Not understanding that the tenant, former homeowner, not understanding that they're never getting their house back. Mm-hmm. So that's something else. I'm not sure if the data can capture that at all, but that's definitely something that's going on in the field.
Yeah, that's right. We actually mentioned that briefly in this year's housing report, the rent to own tendency. We definitely have some data about that, but we definitely need better data about when that is happening, like what you're talking about, because of course it's buried, like
Of course.
on purpose. So it's harder to find that, but we will definitely look into that further.
Right. Well, I want to make a little pivot here. Though this has been incredibly insightful, and thank you all very much for sharing. So really, Chris, this is for you. So we mentioned the investment that our community made doubling down on housing during COVID. And one of the big focuses has been addressing encampments, or people who are sleeping in a public area with a tent or some type of structure. And so it's a permanent residence, but a non-permanent sort of materials used. And so since 2021, our area has decommissioned more than 100 encampments, quite a few of those down in the downtown area, and some of them very, very large. But we still sometimes hear community members and business owners feel like we're not making enough progress. Can you talk about this from sort of your perspective in terms of visibility and perception of homelessness in downtown? And is that important to you in membership? And sometimes does that higher visibility in central Houston, do you think that sort of plays a role in, you can see the data right here, 60% reduction in 10 years, but does that visibility and perception kind of play a role in whether or not there's public support for what we're doing?
I think the hardest part for the coalition and anybody involved in this work is showing progress, right? Because at the end of the day, while that's an impressive chart that's up there, it does not change the way somebody feels when they drive under an underpass and they see folks living in terrible conditions, or if they feel intimidated walking down a particular sidewalk. It's amazing in downtown Houston where we can literally count, it's a couple of hundred homeless folks in downtown Houston. How much of my day, how much of my colleague Albert's day we spend talking about a couple of hundred folks out of 150,000 daytime population. That's the disproportionate impact that this issue has on our community. And I think I chalk it up to a couple of different things. Number one, I think the soul of our community understands that it should be better, right? And when you see somebody who is obviously vulnerable and suffering, you're almost shocked by the level of failure that had to create this situation. Right. It's just, we entered into the social contract, right? We were all supposed to do our part and we're supposed to take care of one another. How the hell is this still happening? Right. I think that's a very real human emotion. On top of that, I would also say that when we talk about homelessness in this community, I almost feel like that's a coded word. And I feel like we use the word homeless as a catch-all or an umbrella team to describe poverty and to describe the appearance of other individuals that may not be homeless at all, right? But they just might be, not wearing shoes, and maybe they just got let out of jail and they're walking down Main Street trying to figure out what to do next, right? That individual might have a place that they're going to, right? And so when we talk about the issue, that's one of the things I challenge my stakeholders with is, how do we know that the person you're talking about is homeless versus the appearance of poverty, which are different things? And unfortunately, I think we bundle that term too loosely to really speak to the conditions that we're all collectively trying to solve. So it remains a top priority because at the end of the day, downtown and many of our neighborhoods and other places, we're essentially in competition, right, with one another. And at the end of the day, every one of our business owners that's trying to get by, they're trying to pay their rent, they're trying to be able to, sell enough Snickers bars and Red Bulls to be able to, make a living of doing it. If there's somebody that's out in front of their business that is deterring others from being able to come into it, that's challenging their livelihood as well, right? And so we have to manage multiple truths at the same time, which is, at the end of the day, most Americans are, when they're confronted by the different or the tendency to other, right, they are uncomfortable, and they start to use words instead of uncomfortable. They start to say that they don't feel safe, right? And the difference between safety and comfort, I think, is a very important distinction to make. And some of this goes back to American, all the things, right? All the things that got us to where we are today, right? Where we've created these sort of racially protected and defined neighborhoods and, or gated communities and whatever it might be. Like there's an expectation in certain environments in the public realm that, that somebody is supposed to keep them safe. And so because they are just unaware of some of the conditions and the complexities, they start to confuse those terms, and they start to make it a different kind of priority. And that starts to drive different kinds of responses from organizations like ours. But, it remains a priority for all of these reasons and more, but it's also a part, I feel it's a part of my job to work to educate our stakeholders, to empower them with information of what we're actually challenged with versus what they perceive is happening.
Yeah. We will have Q&A and we will have time for counterpoints or questions. And I do want to remind folks that there are QR codes on your table, so you can put those questions in right now. You don't have to wait. And we'll answer some of those questions a little later. I think so. You covered a lot right there, Chris, and there's a lot to digest. But I think one of the ones that really stood out to me is racial disparity, right? And I think, like you said, coded language. And Chriselle, you already pointed out that there is inequity in our homeless system. But I think we've kind of talked about that is maybe a reflection of other inequities in our community and our systems. I wonder if you could really talk more about some of how those inequities in other systems sort of help proliferate homelessness. And really, we're just addressing that, as Chris said earlier, the person once they're in the ER.
Right. So one of the major things is what I call institutional segregation. Because the thing about it is segregation has definitely become institutionalized. It's become just a normative way of living. And I feel like Harris County is the epitome of the tale of two counties. We work and we play together despite being touted as one of the most diverse counties, but we don't live together. And that's very, very telling. Something else that is definitely an ongoing issue. And Chris, I thought it was interesting earlier. You said that NIMBY is not as much of a big thing, but it's still a big, it's still a thing. And yeah. So I'm sure everyone knows NIMBY not in my backyard. So of course that's when, folks are fighting to have communities integrated. And this is such a point for me, because in 2011, I think it was, I actually did a public comment for a public, well, it wasn't even public housing. It was a mixed income development in the Galleria area. And I was just amazed. I just went to go and support this particular development. And when I got in there, I was like, oh my God, like this is serious. And it's like around 500 people that showed up on a stormy Tuesday afternoon. That's how you know I was traumatized, because I remember the details. And I was one of maybe 3 Black people there. And I started not to even go up and say anything. So I heard coded language like, they're going to steal the tires off of our cars. What about our seniors? Our children are going to be so unsafe. And so I was like, I don't know if I can go up here and do this. But I thought about the people, and mind you, this was less than 20 units of public housing and like a 250 unit development in the Galleria area. And I stated, that I was in support, and I actually called them out and said, you're claiming to be an inclusive community, and these community members, they're good enough to bag your groceries, to serve your food, and to care for your families. Yet they're not good enough to actually live next door to you. That was not received very well. I had to be escorted to my car because they were crowding me as I walked out, saying, who are you? You don't belong here. And needless to say, the way that it all kind of fizzled out is the project did not go forward. There was a lot of government intervention, although city funds were not funding that project. The city intervened at that point. So all that to say, that was like, that is like the one thing that always sticks out for me, that these systemic barriers, they still exist and they're loud. And if you are part of that population that's within that 50% or more of African Americans that are experiencing homelessness, or if you're in that percentage period, then you understand and know that these systems are still alive and well on an ongoing basis. I feel like I had another point. Let me see. Oh, yes. And the source of income discrimination. That's another major issue. I know our state fought for that, and the state won. And so now it is legal for your source of income to be turned away, regardless of what it is. So if you have a voucher, if you're a veteran, you have a VASH voucher, if you have Social Security, whoever that landlord is, if they don't like your form of payment, they can turn you away. And that's another way of keeping these communities segregated with the haves and the have-nots, where we continue to see a tale of two counties.
Yeah. Thank you, Chriselle and Chris. We talked a lot about a lot of the problems that we have. And so knowing that we don't have all night unless folks really want to stay for a few more hours, I do want to talk about the policies and the measures that we can take that will help affordable housing, will help homelessness. And so Ruth, I really want to kick this to you. So what are some of the antidotes? What are some of the things that we can do to continue to combat homelessness and to make our community more affordable for everyone?
Well, actually, I'd love to build on what Chriselle was just saying, because absolutely, I'm a sociologist. Of course, I love hearing, you sound like a sociologist to me. So I just have to say that. But yeah, there's a lot of research. The other areas that the Kinder Institute is doing research on, including education and economic mobility and community health, it's all connected. And there's a similar overarching pattern across the board. The segregation that you're talking about, of course, our schools are highly segregated. The discrimination evidence, current evidence for discrimination, absolutely the case. So all issues they're all connected, that we all need to definitely be aware of and intervene whenever possible. I love this last example that you just gave about how in Texas, we're allowed to discriminate against folks that are trying to get housing using a voucher, and that doesn't have to be the case. So there's straightforward, maybe not easy, politically feasible, but it's a straightforward solution, right? That we could address, because it's not the case in other states, right? They don't allow that kind of discrimination, because that's what it is. It's another form of discrimination. There are a lot of examples of things that I think are really straightforward, but I'm very concerned about their political feasibility. That's the hang up, and that's something that I maybe with all our minds together we can figure that out. But that's a really tough one. There's another example that I thought that about but I've lost it. So yeah, I think that there are some real possibilities in terms of things that we could do. Oh no, it wasn't your example. Maybe it was Chris's example about things that we can do to make it a little bit easier, or to incentivize more affordable housing. The housing stock issue that you mentioned, we're also seeing that in our projections that there's currently a very significant gap between housing supply and housing demand, in particular in the lower end of the income distribution. That's not what we're seeing in the higher end of the income distribution. There's plenty of housing stock there. So there are things that we can do to try to incentivize folks to really focus on building more units, not building more units necessarily, making them available. And our projections suggest that population will continue to grow and outpace the supply of housing units that are actually affordable for them.
And we're talking extremely low income, right? Is that the group you're talking about?
Yeah, the like 20% of the median income. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, Chris, you already touched on a couple of these, but I think, and you talked certainly, I think, how we can take individual action to increase housing, but from a policy perspective, is there anything you could think that we could do that would help?
Locally? or at any level?
Locally, I think at level, really, yeah.
Yeah, I would start by saying, I think, this is probably going to be unpopular, but the revenue cap creates just a glass ceiling for the city that impedes its abilities to maintain its own infrastructure, right? And so when we talk about who contributes the solution set here, right now the city is a small contributor to solutions, and quite frankly, I think the city can and has the motivation to contribute more because they are experiencing the negative externalities of these challenges more directly, particularly as you talk about law enforcement and strain on public services. And so I think that is something that, nobody wants to say, yay, let's pay more taxes. But at the end of the day, the city is oftentimes having to lower its tax rate to stay under arbitrary cap. And so anything that we can do to create the availability and access to more resources are going to enable a broader set of solutions.
Great. Chriselle, same question to you.
So I think one of the things that we could do, and I think that if we just had the political will, it could be done, is we have so many developers that are taking advantage of these tax incentives, whether it's, like I mentioned, tax abatement, just there an array of tax incentives. And so it should be a requirement that if you are taking advantage of these incentives, then you must provide housing or either set aside at least for the population. It's done in other cities. This is not rocket science. And I remember several years ago, I was in a room, I happened to be in a space, they had an advocate in a space with developers, don't know why. And I asked the developer, I said, so why is it that this doesn't happen in Houston? And his response was simple. We're not asked to do it in Houston, so we don't. Any other state, if it's state or city rather, if it's required, then we do it. So all it takes is a political will. It's not necessarily rocket science, but that's one thing. And then I think something else that we can do that I believe is an easy tweak is really take a look at tenants' rights. We just got out of a legislative session, and there were so many bills that were presented and passed that had to do with homeowners. Where were the tenant bills? I mean, they are comprising in Houston the majority of our population, yet there's no priority for them when it comes to any type of bills, laws that are in place. And so I think that those are two things that we definitely could do. Oh, then there's a third. Don't get me started. Okay, but there's a third also. Especially following COVID, I know that there were definitely high vacancies across the city. Yet those vacancies, they just sat. And there are, again, opportunities to be able to put people in those units. And I know one of the complaints I'll say oftentimes is that, property management doesn't want to necessarily deal with all that comes with that population. And so there was a solution to that. An entity, a third-party entity was actually created to kind of serve as a pass-through. And so that needs to be utilized. We need to look at other tools and other ways of getting things done in the city and not just say that we can't.
Great. Do you have anything that we can be? I'm sorry. I've gone around the circle twice here.
I was going to add to it since you were asking. That's okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I would just underscore. So it's not adding another low-hanging fruit policy, but just underscore what Chris was mentioning earlier about how this is totally attainable. Especially now that we've done the hard work of reducing it by like over 60%. Why not go all the way? It's totally doable. And so that's the main message that I hope people walk away with, that this is not an intractable problem. I hate hearing that phrase because people often refer to homelessness and poverty in general, not to use them interchangeably necessarily, but that people say these are intractable. They're not.
So that actually does lead into my next question. You mentioned we have made progress. We are decreasing homelessness. So what is something that you think we're doing well that we need to scale? What is something, as Chriselle mentioned, being done well in other cities that Houston needs to copy?
Well, I think it's first of all, the housing first approach, I think has a lot to do with why this has been so effective. And that's something that is still debated. We were just talking about this before the panel session. It's still debated today. Like the housing first approach. No, we need to, make people make better decisions. And that's really the cause of all of this. And it's kind of the other way around. So that I think is very effective. We need to keep pushing that, and keep focusing on efforts that use that approach.
Chris, can I ask you the same question? What's something we're doing well that we really should double down or scale up?
I'd say that one of the biggest things that Houston is doing well is defining a strategy and getting the different agencies and entities on board and fostering collaboration and aligning towards really a goal. And I mean, honestly, that is, to me, is one of the most important things. It sounds very simple, but agencies have a tendency to really be insular and inward focused, and focused on self-survival and those kinds of things. So to get right now, dozens of different agencies to be bought into one shared strategy is huge, right? And the next step is, taking really the bold statement and saying, let's get to zero, right? Like that should be our next goal.
Chriselle, same.
So both. And honestly, I feel like we're having more conversations like this in a public realm. That hasn't necessarily happened a lot in the past. And being honest about it, calling out the things that we typically don't want to say. We just need to build that muscle and continue doing that. And also start doing that more with people that we may not already be aligned with. I think that's the next step. I think that we're building the muscle with our friends and our supporters, but now it's time for us to step beyond that so that we can really learn from each other, understand what others that are opposing or that are resistant to some of the things that we're saying, understand where they're coming from, and being able to learn how to approach them in a way where they may accept it a bit more. But I think that that's this step that we're taking now is so important, just to have these ongoing dialogues, regardless of its discomfort.
Right.
I actually think that the greatest challenge has to do with a recurring narrative that, and I alluded to this earlier, that homelessness is a result of bad decisions. And I said, it's actually the other way around. Bad decisions result from being in a desperate situation, or what bad decisions in quotation marks, right? Because I think most of us would make similar decisions in the situation if we were in that situation. So that narrative continues to be very prevalent and powerful across the nation. I am shocked how much I still hear it. And I think that that's sort of at the foundation of everything that happens or does not happen as a result.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's more these people are homeless, and there's really, really significant challenges, and how do we address that? So, and Chris, I know you're involved in the 4C group, and I think this is something. So this goes to two issues. Then, we think about it sort of the 80-20 rule. When we think about homelessness, we think about the 20, or it's actually far less than that, but the 50 or so people who are suffering from the most severe behavioral health issues, maybe suffering from severe cognitive health issues, and are highly visible. That doesn't represent the majority of the population, but it's certainly, and I think, highly visible, and also is highly concerning when you see someone who is really, really struggling, and may be engaging in dangerous behavior. The challenge we have in our community is that helping people with very, very severe mental or cognitive issues is extremely hard to do. And Chris, you've been involved in our 4C, and maybe can talk a little more about that.
Well, sure. And I want to separate out the issues, right? Because at the end of the day, and we deal with this in particular, we have a facility in downtown called the Beacon, which is, an epicenter for a lot of our challenges. Yes, ma'am. Okay. And so this is something that again, we think about every day in our shop is about like, how do we affect positive outcomes at that location? And this is something that we are working in collaboration with law enforcement as well as social service agencies and others to talk about why is it happening here? What is happening? What is the nature of what's happening here? And understanding the difference between an individual that is committing crimes versus an individual that is experiencing homelessness, who is oftentimes the target or the victim of the crimes. And they are ultimately sort of, unfortunately, chum in the water, right, for this, like these individuals who are preying upon them. Right. And so that is something that we are responding to specifically and saying, number one, we've got to facilitate better information sharing between our outreach workers and law enforcement. And that is something that we've only discovered recently. And I got to credit my colleague Albert for really sort of stumbling upon that truth, which is there's a philosophical divide between how we understand the role of a social worker and their outreach services and what they're willing to communicate to law enforcement in the event that an individual is committing crimes, particularly those that affect other people. Right. And so we're working to really help to really create a stronger information flow so that we can better weed out the criminal elements and to help to protect the people that are the most vulnerable. And I think that is, it sounds so much easier than it really is. But ultimately, it comes down to really understanding those communities and those populations, you know, particularly around the Beacon. One of the things we've also noticed is, you know, a strong percentage of the individuals that are out there hanging out around the Beacon are not homeless, right? For your casual observer, it might appear as though they are homeless, but working with the coalition and others, you know, we found out that about 60% of them aren't even in HMIS. They have not had an housing assessment. Many of them are housed, but they have community, right? And that is really what's happening, right? Is community has been established around that place. And so on one hand, you know, you say that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when their actions, when their activities start to affect stakeholders and their neighbors and affect their quality of life, affect their ability to conduct their business, that's when that line is crossed, right? And that's, you know, sort of when we talk about the definition of violence, right? And when does my space suddenly become your space? Those are the actions by individuals that I think we need to be aware of, and we need to be ready to use the right tool and response for those. But also, it's not the same to say that all of those individuals are committing criminal activity. And that's where this sort of criminalization of homelessness becomes a blurry line, because the individuals of a few, unfortunately, are casting a long shadow. And I think they're impeding the way that the general public perceives the issue.
And so, and separate from that, I think people maybe suffering mental health industry for a long time. These people, they have been offered housing many times. And a small percentage of people are interested in people in the clinician's office. These people are suffering from severe mental health or cognitive issues. And so there's an ability on that individual to engage or understand with what's being offered to them. And as someone who has a grandparent who has early onset dementia, right? And I can tell you from someone who is housed and has support and love, that situation that my family is personally going through is incredibly difficult when it comes to having a conversation with someone who still has function, that you can't make decisions for yourself. And I need to be able to make those decisions for you in your best interest. That's difficult in my personal life, but for someone who's on the street who may not even be able to fully communicate or understand what's going on, and they don't have a family or loved one that can advocate on their behalf, as a state, as a community, have the systems, have the laws in place that allow for us to step in and provide support. And, you know, typically conservatorship is one of the things that is talked about. Adult protective services don't have the resources to step in. And this is a really significant issue. And we have a group that brings together mental health, physical health, homeless services, law enforcement, that is working name by name, trying to find solutions for these people. And we've been at it for several months now, and it is incredibly challenging. And so we don't have a solution yet. And the reason why it fits for those people, but I think we acknowledge that that's a problem. We acknowledge that it is not an easy fix, but we also acknowledge that it is something that we're working on And we have organizations like the Harris Center. Also really struggling with this issue as well.
And I just want to say, I think in defense of our partners in law enforcement, who we talk to every day about these kinds of issues, there's not a lack of willingness. What happens is this is where the transition from the city to the county happens. And what we have is a district attorney's office that will not prosecute those cases. And so for that officer, it's, do I want to be off the street for the next 3 hours to process this person and not dealing with real criminal activity, which is also a problem, right? Or do I want to just be in this constant vicious loop in this cycle because we have no alternative to offer? And I think that if anything, I think spotlights the importance of the fact that we need something other than law enforcement. That shouldn't be the only solution to these kinds of problems. That shouldn't be the first line of defense. There should be other tools to help people who are in need, who are experiencing these kinds of conditions. And right now, I think that is one of the biggest gaps in American cities.
Yeah. So
Okay, so I'm an advocate. And so I work with communities and community members and grassroots movement organizations. And so, the thing about it is these companies are able to make all of this money. They have resources, right? And with these resources, they have the lobbyists, they have the folks that go and court, the decision makers. And so the folks that end up being on the other end of it, who are the renters, who are the tenants, they typically don't have those resources. And so unfortunately, what has to end up happening is folks have to galvanize and mobilize themselves and put the political pressure on. Because at the end of the day, although they don't have the finances to necessarily lobby, they do have voting power. And so that's another thing that decision makers do understand is voting power. And the thing that our tenants who are dealing with all these issues have to also understand the power in collectiveness and being collective, and how when they are approaching and they show that they have that collective power, that voting power. I'm not saying it'll happen overnight, but consistency, because I've seen it happen. And I feel like if we want to talk about the way to make change, that's one of the real ways is recognizing our voting power, collectively organizing with each other, and being consistent in talking to and engaging our decision makers.
Could I just chime in there?
yes, is yours working?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, and it's like, oh my gosh, but I couldn't help but start to think creatively about this because, it's almost like vendor procurement in government, right? So if somebody wants to build a road or a bridge or something, cities have to issue an RFP, and this competitive process. Oftentimes they're forced to take low bid, right? And that oftentimes can be a policy. This is really just thinking conceptually, but I mean, it would be interesting to see if entitlements processes had that level of transparency with regards to rate of return on a housing project, right? So that, we don't really have much of a function of zoning in Houston. But if that were a part of, and assuming perfect information on both sides, that would be a mechanism that government could use to be able to limit at least, the gouging of profits.
You mean transparency?
It's like the boundaries that have been put on payday loans, or in some places, not in others, right? But it's the same kind of thing. Like, of course, you have the right to start a loan business, but don't really overdo it and take advantage of people's desperation. That's cruel.
I agree. I agree with all of it. And the thing about it, I feel like you're absolutely right, 100% correct. I have no qualms about it. What it comes down to is the political will in this city and the decisions that are made that stops that can actually curb that. One of the things that I was working on at one point in time was something called preservation districts, where there's a boundary where you keep the taxes at a certain level, regardless of like the property value increasing. But that's something that has to be approved and mandated by the state. And the state preempts so many things that could protect people, that can keep people in their homes. So it's not for the will of the people wanting these things to happen, but it's the politics that are at play constantly here at the city, the county, the state, everywhere. And it's trying to line all of those interests up together to get the outcome for the people that you're talking about.
And we did mention, CDCs, and there are other great organizations. Fifth Ward CRC is an incredible organization, specifically working in a historically Black neighborhood that is experiencing the same thing as Acres Homes in this gentrification. I think you're spot on. There's really great organizations that have long-standing history in these communities that are already doing good work, but the issue of scale. Can we keep up? Can we get ahead of our communities becoming more expensive for the people who are already living there to live in? And I think that's very real.
If I could add, I mean, you mentioned California, and since I come from California, I don't take offense, but in 1978, California did two things, and particularly in Los Angeles, and I think it's important to recognize. Prop 13 froze tax rates for folks who were in the state at the time. And then they also established rent control, right? And so those are two tools at a policy level. We were talking about policy solutions earlier. I mean, those are two tools that are, one was voter approved, and actually they're both voter approved, that we don't have in Houston, right? So we don't have those mechanisms that limit that inflation, but they exist, right? And those are things where we can learn from, God forbid, California, about how we can really start to think about how we protect the folks that are here, like from being priced out, because those are very real concerns.
And so, just real briefly to wrap things up, I'd just like to ask, what is your final thoughts? What is one thing that you'd like the audience to take away from this conversation? And I'll start with Chris, since I'm staring at you already.
We can do it. I mean, it's that simple, and it's really just building a stronger coalition, looking for all of those small moves that are essential to being able to create a bigger outcome. But we can absolutely do this.
Sure.
I would say challenge yourself. Take a look at your own biases. Be an advocate for those who have less than you, and just lean into it.
I just said we can do it and we must do it.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone tonight. And thank you for the questions, and thank you for the engagement. Can we pause for our